Conversations with Gary, a weekly podcast featuring the preaching and teaching ministry of Gary E. Wright. The music is provided by Doug Noonan and Renewal Band and is used with permission.
My faith is in you, Lord.
I want to welcome you to Conversations with Gary. We're starting a series today on the subject of spiritual renewal, spiritual revival. And I can honestly say that I am a student of spiritual renewal and revival in faith communities. I've had the wonderful pleasure of being a part of many great movements of the Lord that other people, not just myself, but other people, have validated that it was a great spiritual revival. I grew up in a home where my parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles and cousins were so excited about Jesus. They were so excited about seeing people come to Christ. And they were also really excited about revival in the community and local churches, because they really felt like that revival was the hope of the church. And so we're going to do this whole series on revival. And, I'm starting with One Divine Moment, which was the first book that was written about the Asbury revival, the Asbury College revival, and now it's Asbury University, but is written by Dr. Robert Coleman, and he quotes the president of Asbury College, who was president when the revival of 1970 took place. And Dr. Dennis Kinlaw said, "Give me one moment, one divine moment when God acts, and I say that moment is far superior to all the human efforts of man throughout the centuries." And of course, that's the title of the book, One Divine Moment. And this is a happening that I experienced at Asbury College, and it changed my life. I've never been the same again since that. And it helped me understand that whole communities can be changed when God comes. For a working definition, I would say that I would define revival as God pouring out his presence on a group of people, a faith community, a church, whatever. God pouring out his presence. And when his presence is there, he is so powerful that lives get changed. And there are really two kinds of revivals that we will talk about. And the Asbury revival, that was what we would call a spontaneous, unplanned revival. I have spent my life going from community to community across the United States and the world, doing the second kind, which would be efforts of planned revivals. Now, just because you plan one doesn't mean it happens, because God has to pour out his presence in a community, and that just doesn't happen just because we schedule it on the calendar. And so we're going to look at what it really means to have this poured out presence of God, this thing that we've called revival. And if you're wondering, I'm a little old school on this. I really believe that God changes communities through revival. And I've got a lot of experiences and can witness to that change. But I thought first we ought to lay the biblical foundation of what we're talking about. And so I picked what I believe is probably the biblical, historical situation where it just shows so clearly how revival comes to a community. And it starts with a young king in the Old Testament. We're looking at 2 Chronicles chapters 29 and 30. And the young king, his name is Hezekiah. He was only 25 years old, which in his day, 25 was not regarded as somebody who really you would look for as being a leader. He was considered too young, too inexperienced. And he took the job as king at a time when his country, God's people, Israel, were in serious trouble spiritually. They had become involved in idolatry, and the moment they did that, along came all kinds of moral sins that would be a part of their community and their families and their lives. Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. And I want you to notice, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. His father, they're really saying his ancestor. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the temple of the Lord and repaired them. Now, I just want you to notice, it says first month, first year of his reign. You know what that means? That means this guy, his priority had to do with opening up God's place of worship and reestablishing among Israel their relationship with the Lord. That was his priority. Now, he's 25 years old, and yet this is his priority. And first year of his reign, first month, he decides we need to have church. We need to get things back to where they ought to be. And so where does he start? He starts with the leaders of what we would call the church. For him, it was the synagogue and temple. It says he brought in the priests and Levites, and the Levites were part of the tribe of Israel that took care of all of the facilities for worship and what we would call church. He assembled them in the square on the east side, and he said, "Listen to me, Levites. Consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple of the Lord, the God of your ancestors." Now, this is pretty strong talk. He's not messing around here. These guys, most of them are going to be older than him. He brings in the priests, brings in all the leaders, and he says, "You know what? You need to get the sin out of your life. And you need to get the sin out of our church, our synagogue. Consecrate yourselves." Now, in the Old Testament, that would have meant a lot of ceremony and a lot of work. And he says, "We're going to do this, so start with yourself. Consecrate yourselves." That's what he says, consecrate yourselves now. This is a leader taking hold of a spiritual situation that's not good and says, we need to turn this around. And he says, you start with you. Remove all the defilement from the sanctuary. What's he talking about? They actually had put idols of other gods. It was kind of like they'd turned the sanctuary into kind of a storage place, They'd stored other idols. And it says, our parents were unfaithful. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord our God, and they forsook him. This country of Hezekiah's is in a mess. This is a mess. They turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place and turned their backs on him. There's a few nations right now throughout the world that's turned their back on God, and there would be many who would say our own country has done that. It says they also shut the doors of the portico and put out the lamps. They did not burn incense. What he's saying is they stopped going to church. They stopped worshiping God. They hung it up, quit. And because he says the anger of the Lord has fallen on Judah and Jerusalem. He has made them an object of dread and horror and scorn, as you can see with your own eyes. Yeah, we're in trouble. Armies are marching on us. We've got troubles. And our troubles is because we've turned our back on God. We haven't done what we should do. Things are a mess. He says, this is why our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and daughters and wives are in captivity. He said it's affected all of us. He said we've got soldiers, fathers around here who died, and our kids, our children are in captivity. He said, you guys, I want you to get yourself right with the Lord. And I want you to clean up this mess so we can get back to worshiping God like we should do. Now, here's where revival starts. Right here. King Hezekiah, 25 years old, says, now I intend to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger will turn away from us. Now he's told them, you guys need to consecrate yourselves, get yourself cleaned up spiritually, get the synagogue cleaned up spiritually. But here's where it begins. They're probably not going to like him talking to them that way. You know, most of us, we don't like somebody saying, you need to get the sin out of your life, or you need to get with God. You need to go to church. You need to do this. You need to do that. And we go, okay. But here's where it begins. He says it's in my heart to make a covenant with God. Okay. A covenant was a serious agreement. It wasn't just some little good, lay me down to sleep prayer. This was a life and death agreement between a man and God, where he will tell God, if I don't honor this agreement with you, you can kill me. I'm serious. I want God's wrath to turn away from me and our people. He said us, but he says I intend. This is about what he's going to do. I intend to make a covenant with God, the Lord of Israel. So now he says to his language here tickles me, because I know he's in a room with a bunch of old guys, and they've got their egos and they've got their reputations that have to do with spiritual things and religion and all that. And he says, my sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him and to serve him and to minister before him and to burn the incense. And then the Levites set to work. So he really gets in their face. He says, don't be negligent. God picked you to be our pastors and to be our leaders and to be our preachers and teachers and to take care of the spiritual needs of our nation. And he says, don't be negligent. And he's really saying, you have been. Now stop it. Get to what you're supposed to be doing. And when they assembled the fellow Levites and consecrated themselves, they went in to purify the temple. So they did it. They did what this young king was asking them to do. They went before God. They repented of their sin. They asked God to forgive them. And then they started going into the actual worship facilities and cleaning it up as the king had asked him to do. Now let me tell you, in this day and age of this king, it was nothing that somebody slipped a knife to the king and they would appoint a new king. This is bold, courageous action by a young 25-year-old who's decided that the most important thing in his country is that he and his people worship God. It says the priests went into the sanctuary of the Lord to purify it, and they brought out to the courtyard of the Lord's temple everything unclean they had found in the temple of the Lord. So this place was a mess, but they got right to it. And remember, we had in the opening of this, first year of the king, first month, okay? And so here they are. Early the next morning, King Hezekiah gathered the city officials together and went up to the temple of the Lord. So the preachers, the teachers, all the leaders, they got the temple ready to worship. And notice, early the next morning, the king says, hey, I want all of the politicians from our city. I want you to meet me at church. He's king. He's got a little clout. He's using it. We all have a little clout. We all have some influence of other people. What are you using yours for? Here's this guy. He tells all the politicians in town, we need to go to church first thing in the morning. I don't know what their plans were, but he changed them. And so the service of the temple of the Lord was reestablished, and Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced at what God had brought about for his people because it was done quickly. Isn't that amazing? It says it was done quickly. It's fantastic how, if God shows up, how quick things can happen. I just want you to notice here, I made a little diagram for you, where this revival begins. It begins with one guy saying, it's in my heart to make an agreement with God that I'm so serious, he could take my life. It's in my heart to make an agreement. And he uses his influence to say to other people, the other leaders, we need to clean this up. You go get right with the Lord. You go get things right. So he started with himself. And then he went to the priests and the spiritual leaders of the community. And then he goes to the politicians of the city, all the cities. He starts with leaders and says, we need to clean this up. I believe the same thing needs to happen today. I believe we need to start with you and me saying, I'm going to do what I got to do to clean up my mess. And I can't do it by myself. I need the Lord. And we need to influence those around us that God has given to us. And he starts with the house of God. Let me tell you, this library here that you can see around me is full of books on stories of communities, colleges, churches that were changed. And almost always it began with what we see here. It began with prayer. When they went to the sanctuary, they were praying. And even as they carried all the trash and the idols out of there, they were praying. They were cleansing that. The only way you can cleanse a place, we're not talking about just sweeping the floor. We're talking about spiritual cleansing. We're talking about the fact that there is an evil one in our world, and we confront him and say, no, you're not going to have at my family. You're not going to have at my household. You're not going to have at my church. You're not going to have at my college. No. And it begins in prayer. And it begins with making sure we're right with God. And that's what Hezekiah was doing. He was saying, I need to be right with God. And so I want to encourage you, look at chapters 29 and 30 of 2 Chronicles. Because we're going to come back here and finish this in part 2 of this revival. It begins with someone saying, it's in my heart to get things right with God, to make a covenant. Covenant was the most serious way in prayer a human being could approach God and say, I want to make a commitment. I want you to know, God, you can count on me, and here's what we can do. That's where Hezekiah started, and he encouraged everybody around him that were supposed to be spiritual leaders or leaders of the city. And in part 2, we're going to find out what happened. Did he get it done? Did it really happen? That's part 2. Thanks for listening today on Conversations with Gary.
Day after day, I ask all the questions, still trying to find a way. Then I trusted in Jesus.